and in some cases this logic will need to be modified by aspects of belief. The mind, it turns out, is quite capable of doing this processing. If necessary, thinking can iterate back to the left hemisphere by means of ESTP and send data around the loop a second time. It can initiate conversation with someone else as data passes from CL to FL and solicit their opinion. It can even ponder the meaning of their words within the perceiving loop. When all is said and done, perceiver belief delivers the conclusions to CR. In this way, left hemisphere CL and right hemisphere CR are coordinated by perceiver analysis, so that both are looking at a similar object, which is the element in the CL sequence which is currently unready to hand in the context of the current action sequence. What happens next? The right hemisphere frontal eye fields and right hemisphere CR are responsible for visual saccades, or eye movements, and they do this searching in real time as needs arise. Right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was involved in goal-directed visual search, but showed no delay activity. In other words, the searching was done in real time. The eyes look, and let's suppose they see that flour is located nearby, in a bag that is owned by a neighbor. In Martin Heidegger's terms, the neighbor's flour is right hemisphere present at hand. It isn't yet left hemisphere ready to hand, because it belongs to my neighbor, but it certainly is right hemisphere present at hand. Now, that brings us to the question of ownership. How does that work? John Locke, the perceiver, tells us that ownership results when we mix our labor with some object. Adam Smith, a contributor economist, speaks in turn of the labor theory of value. Perceiver strategy deals with links, and Locke tells us that these connections will link some object to our own person or being as we work with that object. It's all part of the operation of the classification loop. This issue of ownership ultimately becomes a perceiver belief, which also is delivered to CR. Ownership, we might add, makes a lot of sense to the human mind. When we own something, then it becomes permanently left hemisphere ready to hand. The mind can relax and maintain itself at the lower level of CL absorbed coping or dealing, in which it disappears into its environment. When a supply of owned goods is present in abundance, then FL, in turn, can move to maximal utility, without being limited by budgetary constraints or right hemisphere threats of unpleasant consequences for violating these constraints. That also is relaxing. Okay, CL has noticed that flour is missing, and CL and CR, with the help of perceiver analysis and its thinking loop, have managed to focus successfully on the same object, flour. In this way, according to Heidegger, the mind has arrived at the truth of the current matter. Truth, Heidegger assures us, is a thing as it is in itself, as it becomes visible, we may add, in both CL and CR, so that there is nothing left to describe. Neurologically, we conclude that truth is a common focus in the frontal eye fields in both left and right hemispheres. It appears to be as simple and as complex as that. All right, it's evident that we'll need to make an exchange in order to acquire our neighbor's bag of flour. How is that to be done? Karl Marx, the contributor philosopher, tells us that the process involves an interaction between exchange value and use value. Use value is determined by the current context, which in our case is the making of bread, and is therefore calculated within the contingency loop. The only element of this circuit which we have not yet described as carrying out a function is server analysis, and that is the strategy which performs the task of assigning the required use value. It determines what the object, in this case flower, is good for, based on the current task sequence. Then, server analysis turns around in the sensing loop for which it does the pre-processing, and it mediates an exchange. We've already noticed that our neighbor has a bag of flour. Let's suppose that he is making cake, and he needs sugar. I have an extra bag of sugar. He may agree to transfer the flour away from his left hemisphere ready to hand to my right hemisphere present at hand, so that I can use it, if I, on my part, will agree to make an equivalent exchange with the sugar. Now, that brings us to an important issue. What are the critical elements that need to be addressed in an exchange? For instance, if we examine an apartment rental contract, we'll see that it requires an address, a rental price, a deposit amount, and a beginning date. There are spaces in the contract for us to fill those things in. Mathematicians might think of it as a function statement. The rest of the rental contract is all fine print, a kind of grayed-out assumed legal background. Which strategy in the mind decides what is foreground and what is assumed background, so that CL can choose without being overwhelmed by irrelevance? It is server thought that does it, through its capacity of decision. You may recall that we already saw it in speech. Server strategy defines a speech envelope into which other strategies insert their content. That's also a matter of decision. Okay, so my neighbor and I decide to exchange my sugar for his flour. How is the ownership actually altered? Perceiver strategy this time does it by delinking the bag of flour from my neighbor's being and attaching it to my own being or Dasein. Sometimes a contract is signed so as to involve the being of Dasein more explicitly. Perceiver conscience on its part seals the deal, and the result is enforced by society through restitutive or punitive law as necessary. How would we set a transfer price if we wished to move beyond barter? Well, the left hemisphere and CL deal with adverbs, such as too heavy or not enough. These emerge as things become unready to hand. It's the right hemisphere that operates with absolute numbers, such as 1 bag of flour or 5 pounds of sugar. These right hemisphere numbers allow the precise measurements required by the scientific method, even as the same right hemisphere also separates the observer from the thing which is to be observed, so that the resulting detached object may be exchanged for something else. The sensing loop, for which server strategy does the pre-processing, can now work out some right hemisphere exchange value as an absolute number, based upon the current subjective left hemisphere contextual use value. The exchange is made, and CL can relax again into an absorbed coping or dealing that releases the appropriate actions in the sequential action set, which is the left hemisphere time-dependent interpretation of the right hemisphere spatially determined plan. In our case, we can begin to bake bread. Server analysis injects the particulars that adapt the stored contingency habits to the current situation. Its decisions shape contributor will to the present circumstances, so that CL will remains relevant. In real time, that is, it supplements the adjustments made by a longer range Weltanschauung. We can therefore make our bread successfully using the battered square pan which is currently available to us, along with the slightly bent spoon with which we must measure the salt. When left hemisphere contributor CL has progressed all the way through the CR action sequence, CL will sense that the result is delicious, and left hemisphere FL can inform me that I am happy. What is me? Ah, that's another